But just wanted to kick us off very quickly. Hello and welcome to the Yale Food Systems Symposium. We're the first panel of the conference and we're really excited about that. This is a conference that's been organized by students from Yale School of the Environment. And through 5 other panels, as well as events and workshops, we're exploring how we can build a more justice, human, and earth-oriented food system. So we'd like to thank the experts that are speaking today. We're going to be hearing their bios in a little bit. But very briefly, today's panel is Building Resilient Meat Supply Chains, Wellbeing for Workers, Rural Economies, and the Environment. So this panel is going to explore the nuances of American animal agriculture, recent changes and shocks to the system of food production, and the effect these changes have had on meat producers, workers, and the environment. Our panelists will consider what American agriculturalists can do to reimagine meat supply chains that are good for workers, rural economies, and the planet. And we think that this topic is especially fitting as the Biden administration will tackle issues like worker safety in meatpacking plants and climate change mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. So we'll go ahead and get started with the panel. My name is Forrest Abbott-Lum, and I'll be moderating along with Katie Pophall. I'm a second-year Master of Environmental Management student, and I study agricultural climate solutions. Over to Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Pophall, and I'm also a second-year Master of Environmental Management student. I focus on land conservation, and in particular ways that land conservation organizations can work more effectively with communities to achieve lasting solutions. I've recently worked with the Nature Conservancy in California and the U.S. Climate Alliance's Natural and Working Lands program. And I also grew up in southern Wisconsin and came from a dairying family. So I have a strong connection to animal production, and I care a lot about this work. So now we'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves briefly in a minute or two. And we'll get the chance to hear more from them and their experience a little bit later in the seminar. But we'll start today with Lisa Held, who's a journalist for Civil Eats and Peeled.
Hi, thank you so much. As Katie said, I'm Lisa Held. I'm a freelance journalist and I cover food and agriculture. And I have reported pretty extensively on the meat industry, both on the largest corporations and CAFOs and also on small farms and ranches that sell meat locally. My stories tend to focus on how the food system intersects with environmental impact, worker rights, and community impact. I am currently the senior policy reporter for Civil Eats, and I write for many other publications. And I have a Substack newsletter called Peeled and a podcast on Heritage Radio Network called The Farm Report.
Thank you. Next, let's go to William Bernage, the Deputy Director for the Sustainable Grazing Lands for the Nature Conservancy, Colorado.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, everybody. My job entails working on policy related to grazing lands with corporate engagement, working with multilateral as well as bilateral initiatives in the beef industry, addressing science and research, and then putting grazing land practices on the ground on the Nature Conservancy's 500,000 acres of grazing lands in the United States. I've been with the Conservancy for almost 16 years, and before moving into this position for 15 years, I had responsibility for day-to-day operations on a number of our ranches and leased properties. So excited to be here today, looking forward to sharing.
Thanks, William. Next up, we'd like to hear and meet Magali Licoli. She's the co-founder of Venceremos.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Well, my name is Magali Licoli. I am originally from Mexico. I've been living in Arkansas for 17 years. My background is political theater, but ever since I moved to Arkansas, I've been working very closely with the community, and I've been organizing with poultry workers for over 5 years. And I finally co-founded Venceremos with a group of poultry workers back in 2019. And right now we are organizing efforts during the pandemic, and I'll be happy to share more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for being here. And now we'll pass it to Austin Frederick, the Deputy Director of the Thurmond Arnold Project here at Yale.
Thank you. Yeah, I am from Eastern Iowa. I'm helping to start a new antitrust center here at Yale. I've written pieces in the American Conservative, to the Prairie Populist, Fast Company, among others. My goal is to focus on elevating the discourse of agriculture antitrust enforcement in America. What I kind of love about it is I think it's one of the few bipartisan issues in this country at this moment.
Thanks, Austin. Looking forward to hearing more about that. And then we'll hear from John Haneyman, the Executive Director of the Plank Stewardship Institute and co-owner of Padlock Ranch.
Hello, thank you for thanks for let me speak. I run a small young nonprofit that's focused on merging conservation practices with agriculture. We work primarily in southeastern Montana and northeastern Wyoming, and that's interesting work. And my background and kind of professional heart lies in cattle ranching itself. My family run a large cattle ranch on the border of Montana and Wyoming. Beef cows, cow calf, and a feedlot operation.
Great. Well, we're just so lucky to have this lineup of people from different parts of the animal product supply chain, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. Just wanted to extend again our greatest gratitude for you all being here today to share this wisdom, and you know, for bearing with us during some technical difficulties too. So we're looking forward to it. Now I'm going to pass it over to Forrest, who's got our first question. And I just wanted to note, we invite you as these questions, your questions come up as the audience, please put them in the Q&A, the chat, the Q&A feature of the webinar, and we can get to those after we've had a couple of initial questions with our guests.
Great, thank you, Katie. So we'd like to start off by understanding how meat is produced in the United States today. As our panelists know, large companies operate much of the meat industry, from poultry farms and meatpacking plants to cattle feedlots and slaughterhouses. However, there are many different kinds of farmers, ranchers, workers, and professionals that help get these products to our plate. So we'd like to know a little bit more about the way meat is produced in your part of the supply chain, and a few of the important roles that people and the environment play. So I'd like to start off from hearing from John and then William. Perhaps you can start by telling us a bit more about how cattle are raised and the steps that get them to our plates. So starting with John and then bouncing to William.
All right, well, thank you. So our operation is pretty common out here. The difference in our operation is scale, because we're a big ranch. So we have mama cows. And we expose those cows to bulls in the summertime, and we calve. We, like most of the industry, we wean the calves at 6 to 7 months, and that's the beef cow, that's the cow calf sector of the industry. Once calves are weaned, they move into a feeder, the feeding sector of the industry, or the backgrounding, more specifically backgrounding segment of the industry. My family, we cover both those segments. We have our backgrounding feedlot. So we take weaned calves of reasonably lightweight, like a 400 to 500 pound calves, and we keep them and feed them a very roughage-based diet of feedstuffs we raise ourselves to about 850 pounds, at which point then they go to a finishing feedlot, which is what people understand as kind of a typical finishing feedlot. But our cows they're outside. We see them we touch them 2 or 3 times a year at most. It's very Western. It's the kind of the cowboy. It's the image of the cowboy. It is alive and well on our particular ranch. We don't use much. Don't use many 4-wheelers or motorcycles. We have lots and lots of horses. So that's how our operation works.
Great, thank you so much, John. We'd love to hear from you as well, William.
Sure, and maybe I can take it from there and outline a little bit of how the cattle then move from the feeding operation to our dinner plates. And after that backgrounding phase, and I'm sure John will jump in and correct me if I mischaracterize any of this, but they tend to go to a finishing feeding operation, and we're talking here primarily about conventionally produced cattle, which means in this context grain finished cattle. So they move from a backgrounding operation to that finishing operation where they are fattened. They are then at about, John is about 18 months of age, 18, 20 months of age, harvested typically. And
12 to 1,300 pounds,
12
or whenever that's
pounds.
the limiting factor, is the weight.
Yeah, that's kind of the sweet spot from an efficiency standpoint and a rate of gain standpoint. They're harvested and then our process broken down into primal cuts and then go through often a number of other kind of processing stages in order to either go to restaurants, food service organizations, or to the grocery where we find them packaged and ready for purchase. And so it is a huge industry in the United States. There are roughly, starting at the cow-calf sector, about 700,000 producers in the United States, 90% of whom are family-run operations, some large like John's, some smaller, but primarily family-run. And they operate on about 775 million acres in the United States. That's about 40% of the continental U.S. land mass. It is the largest single land use in the United States. And I think with those statistics alone, it helps explain why the Nature Conservancy is really motivated to work on grazing land sustainability and improve outcomes for people and nature on those lands, and why we should all care about beef production. Our working grazing lands are really the only place where we can maintain native plant communities and intact soils, while also stewarding important ecosystem services and wildlife habitat in exactly the same place where we produce food, and an important food source here in the United States and really globally. And so it's a unique opportunity and vitally important from an environmental as well as a food production standpoint.
It's an interesting, and thank you, William. I think that's all spot on. I think one of the ways to think about why beef production is so widespread in the country is that most of the country is, particularly in this part of the world, is very arid, and cows are a multi-stomach animal, and they can take a very low quality protein in these forages that do exist, the native grasses that exist all over the high plains, and turn it into a high quality protein. They can take a low quality grass protein and turn it a high quality protein in the form of meat. And in that respect, it's very efficient. And I would argue that it's ecologically compatible. When the calves go into the finishing feedlots, things change. And I'll be the first to admit that for sure. One of the, it's a difficult industry, and there's a tremendous amount of individual operators, but the concentration in the industry starts in the cow-calf segment and then gets exacerbated in the finishing and then the slaughter industries. The average beef cow herd in the country as of 2017 or so is about 43 animals. The herds over 100 head make up almost 10% of the herds in the country, and they produce 56% of the inventory of slaughter cattle. So it really is quite concentrated. I would argue that to be profitable in this part of the world, because things are so dry, you need probably 500 or 600 animals to be profitable in a standalone enterprise. So a huge amount of calves are raised by kind of part-time farmers and ranchers, which is nothing wrong with that. It's not their full-time occupation. There's a relatively few number of full-time operators. Those concentrated numbers get even more so in the feedlot industry. Feedlots, I'm reading off my notes, feedlots with less than 1,000 head make up the majority of operations in the country, but a very small share of the animals. Feedlots with over 1,000 head make up 5% of the total feedlot operators, but they market 80 to 85% of the fed animals. And even more than that, feedlots with a capacity of over 30,000 head make up 40% of the marketed animals. So really, the market, the capital intensity of this industry, particularly at the feeding and harvesting, in those segments, is really difficult to get your head around. It's extraordinarily expensive.
Thank
Yeah.
you for that, John. I know there are a lot of thoughts on concentration that I think Austin will be talking about in a bit. I hate to take the spotlight away from cows, but we do have to move on to chicken.
Oh.
I would love to hear from Magali about how poultry is produced in your part of the US and the landscape of labor organizing and workers' rights within poultry.
Yes, thank you. Well, there are nearly 30,000 poultry workers working in the chicken production in Arkansas, and the majority of these workers are immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and Puerto Rico recently. There is also a large majority of Asians, especially from the Marshall Islands, and also in South Arkansas, the majority of the workers are Black workers. And more recently, we have seen like changing in demographics. More refugees are coming to the state of Arkansas to work in the chicken plants. And I want you just to mention that for these companies, they are always eager for vulnerable workers. And historically, I mean, the immigration in Arkansas began because of these jobs. So actually, Tyson has records of bringing illegally workers from Mexico to work in these processing plants. So they are often eager to find vulnerable workers, because the most vulnerable the worker is, the more afraid are for them to speak up. So living in a wide rural communities, they often feel isolated, and they often feel like nobody cares for their lives. And I said this because for me, organizing with poultry workers has been a process of trust, of building that trust. When I learned about the horrible working conditions of poultry workers when I was working in a community clinic 2 blocks from this big Tyson plant, and I heard the stories, it was to me shocking that nobody really talked about it. You know, and when I tried to talk about these issues, it was like a taboo. Nobody really wanted to touch on Tyson because Tyson is so well respected. Tyson is based in Arkansas, so they control a lot of, they give away so much charities that they ended up silencing the community. And so their jobs really entails of working in the farms, growing the chickens, and usually what this company has, what these corporations have done is to get rid of the responsibility to protect workers who work in the farms. You know, I've seen that the catchers, the one that works in the farm, catching the birds, put them in a cage so they can transport it to the plant. Those workers are the most unprotected workers because the majority of them are undocumented. And because the companies have delegated these jobs to a subcontractor, so they hire a subcontractor, and so technically this catcher is not hired by the company. And so it's often very hard to fight for issues related to wage theft, to discrimination, etc. And so once they catch the bird, it goes to the processing plant. And right there you have the slaughtering houses where they hand the chicken, and then goes to the processing, evisceration, deboning, frying, packing, depending of the plant. There is some plants that are focused more in the slaughtering, others more in frying or cooked chicken. But it's often the conditions of workers. It's worse in the slaughtering houses and the debone departments because workers work shoulder to shoulder and they act like machines. I mean, for them, these workers, this morning I was talking to a worker, and somebody asked him, what does he feel about being an essential worker? And he said something that struck in my mind. And he said, well, we are not essential workers. We are treated like essential machines. And so, by saying that, he meant that, I mean, they just have one function for the company, to work as fast as possible. Right now, the line speed goes to 145 chickens per minute. During the pandemic, the line speed has been increase, or the USDA has given some waivers to some companies to increase the line speed to 174 birds per minute. So that means that workers don't have access to bathrooms, to bathroom breaks, don't enough access to breaks. They act like machines. They need to be there working, doing a task, and the repetitive motions lead to a long life injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome. The high levels of chemicals have led to a lot of respiratory problems of workers. And so right now, they have to keep up with the production no matter how many workers are on the line. And it's been devastating, it's been horrible. And so yeah, these companies, every year they care to increase the production and to decrease the health and safety of these workers.
Thank you, Magali. That was really powerful. This is a perfect segue into Austin's area of expertise. Austin, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about consolidation in the industry and the current landscape of corporate landscape of how meat is produced in America.
Well, I just want to add on to the Tyson point. I think what's been kind of unknown is that when the body of law in this space is the Packyard and Stockyard Act, and that's celebrating its 100-year anniversary this year. When that law was written, Americans really didn't eat a lot of chicken. And so poultry was not listed as one of the meats in that legislation. That's why Tyson has able to basically exploit this loophole and be incredibly abusive to workers and farmers in the production of chicken. On a happy note, Senator Booker and the new senator from Georgia, Warnock, introduced legislation to kind of close that gap. But just that for context. And there's a great book called The Meat Racket by Chris Leonard I recommend to read if you just want to learn that history more. It's, I don't want to say painful. It's, there's no other way to say it. The American meat industry now is more concentrated than when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. You're seeing like a few dynamics play out. What's even more scary, in my opinion, is these meat monopolies are foreign-owned corporations, and they're usually state-owned. So like the largest beef packer in America is a state-backed Brazilian company. The largest hog packer in America is a Chinese-backed, quasi-state-owned, quasi-military-owned, depending on which reporting you read, hog slaughterhouse. They also are the largest owner of hogs in America. They own 1 in 5. So you're seeing that vertical play too that Tyson's has as well in the chickens. I think what's different this time around is there's this illusion of choice. It used to be back in the day, a monopoly, you're buying Standard Oil. Now what they realize is that Whole Food shopper doesn't want to buy the same item as a Dollar General shopper, so they have different brands, even though it's kind of basically essentially the same product. There are nuances to that. The example I use is Niman Ranch. Niman Ranch is a premium pork line. It's the way hogs used to be raised. Most pork eaten in America now come from hogs that never see a light of, never see the sunshine, never see a blade of grass. They're raised in a metal shed. These hogs are raised the traditional way, but that company is now owned by Purdue Farms, a big chicken conglomerate. So the whole Michael Pollan notion, the theory of change for the last 20, 30 years in America has changed the system with your fork, go to Whole Foods. If you don't like the option, Dollar General, whatever. Most of those brands you see in Whole Foods anymore are owned by the big companies. They just bought them. It's just their new white yuppie brand. So what I should also say, as these industries are super concentrated, it's really, really easy to act like a cartel when it's just 3 or 4 companies. There was a point last year where every single meat in America was under investigation in some form for price fixing. There's been a lot of settlements recently in chicken price fixing, but they're nothing more than a slap on the wrist. And I think it's safe to assume that this behavior will continue. I'm a little concerned that Biden's nominee need to be Secretary of Agriculture. Tom Vilsack of my home state, former governor of mine, doesn't believe in antitrust enforcement. He was also a corporate lobbyist when he said this last summer. And what we see when we see the impacts with workers, what it means when one company controls 20 hog slaughterhouses, it's a lot harder to organize as a union versus 3. And probably to me, another big scary trend we've seen in this area is the collapse or near collapse of the family meat and dairy farm. Beef is an exception. Beef is a different model. But like Iowa's lost 90% of hog farms since the election of President Reagan. And I think a lot of rural communities in America are seeing the result of that. I mean, even taking Wisconsin dairy, is collapsing in Wisconsin and moving to the Southwest. For example, Mexico does 3 times more dairy than Vermont. That makes no sense. It's a desert, but so be it.
Great, thank you so much, Austin. On to Lisa. You've reported on so many different areas of the meat supply chain. We just love to know, is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'll just kind of fill in a couple of things to add to all of that really incredibly valuable information. One cool distinction I think that I'd just like to point out, but in what's been said already, is I think it's important to understand the fact that, you know, when John was talking about cattle in this country, that all cattle really start on grass and spend most of their lives on grass, and then the feedlot is that last step. Whereas in pork and poultry, those animals, those companies are like totally vertically integrated, and the animals are essentially, the farmers are contracted from day one with the companies like Tyson, and the chicks are sent to the contracted farmer. They're put in those sheds, and they never, you know, leave the shed until they're shipped to slaughter. So it's a very different system in pork and poultry compared to beef. So I think that's one thing some people don't understand. And then the other thing I'd like to add is that there is this alternative meat system in our country that nobody has sort of touched upon yet, which is kind of, you know, the very, very small farms doing grass-fed beef, doing pastured poultry, doing chickens on pasture, and, you know, selling at their local farmers markets, increasingly during COVID, selling online, forming co-ops, selling, shipping nationally via online ordering. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny drop in the bucket compared to this massive consolidated system that we have in the country. And the really important thing is I've been reporting on a lot of infrastructure that has been kind of improving in local processing. There's a lot of policies that are being proposed currently to improve slaughterhouse access for small farmers, for instance. And there's some really cool efforts in the Bay Area forming co-ops to so grass-fed beef producers can process their own animals. But all of this is happening at the same time as the consolidated system is becoming more consolidated, and everything is getting bigger. So there's been this, actually Austin mentioned the sort of Michael Pollan, there's movement for these smaller producers to make a difference and do things differently. But those people are doing things differently, but it hasn't changed the larger industry at all, I would argue, based on my reporting. And in fact, the larger system just continues to get bigger and more consolidated. It's not like making a dent in that.
Thank you. I mean, I'm sure we could stay on this panel for about 3 hours, but unfortunately time is limited. This topic has come up organically, but we want to talk about challenges to the food system next. So meat supply chains are affected by so many different factors, from natural resource availability to policy changes. So we wanted to know from each panelist, from your viewpoint, what are the main challenges that face the food system and your work in this space? Essentially, what motivates the work that you do? And we'd love to start off with Magali and then Austin.
I'm sorry, I had a call with a worker. Could you repeat the question again?
That call sounds extremely important. The question is basically, what motivates the work that you do, and what do you see as the main challenge in the food system?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I'm motivated to do this work because when I heard the stories of, I'm sorry, it's just they're calling me. Sorry, I don't know what is going on. So when I began organizing with poultry workers, it was because of for me, it was important to realize that if we take care of these workers, the working conditions, fair wages, we could do a tremendous impact in the state of Arkansas. The state of Arkansas is one of the poorest states in the country, yet we have two of the biggest corporations in the country and Walmart worldwide. And so how is it possible that these billion companies are in Arkansas and yet we are so poor? And it has to do a lot of the consolidation of corporate power that these corporations have gained in state and federal levels. And these corporations have lobbied so much to protect themselves and to actually hurt the few rights that workers have, like workers' compensation. You know, it's very hard for workers to file a workers' claim. Back in 2012, when I heard the stories of poultry workers who were in this huge chemical accident in 2011, many of these workers were unable to return to work for life because they have injuries in their lungs with 60% capacity, and they were single mothers. And to me, it was shocking that these workers are expendable, and if we don't do anything about that, we are going to keep perpetuating these cycles of poverty into which the workers are already hurt or harmed by for life, and they do not have any other option but to seek community support, government support, you know, while these corporations keep gaining and making rich themselves through the years. And so to me, for me, it was a huge responsibility. It was just not hearing the story say, oh, poor people. It was about like, this is not fair. In Mexico, when I was in Mexico, I always heard people were immigrating to the US for a better life. After I heard those stories, to me, this was not a better life. This was exploitative, humiliating my community. And to me, I took it personal. And so I was, even though I also faced many racism in this community, in theater, at the University of Arkansas, everywhere, I was a more privileged immigrant. I was able to learn English as my second language. I was able to get a university degree. And to me was like, I need to use what I've gained to fight with my people. And so yeah, I think if we are able to change the working conditions of these workers, we'll do a tremendous impact in the economy of the state of Arkansas.
Thank you, Magali. Austin, we'd love to hear more what motivates your work and what you think the key challenges are to the food system.
Yeah, I mean, mine just honestly started until I was intellectually curious, where I noticed in Iowa and college that the highest school districts in the state with for free reduced lunch rates and Latino populations were slaughterhouse towns. I mean, we're talking like 70 or 80% rates. Went on Wikipedia, noticed they were all slaughterhouse towns, and so I wrote my thesis on that. So I went to all these little towns in Iowa: Postville, West Liberty, Perry, Columbus Junction. Talked to the mayors, talked to the teachers, talked to the social workers, superintendents. Because I was actually curious from an educational standpoint, what do you do? How, you know, understanding that. And it was actually in those conversations I similarly heard the same thing of, they would critique all these societal ills, you know, oh, these kids, you know, they're coming with all these baggages, you know, but they would always tell me how great the plant was. Oh, we get free hot dogs. Whereas like in the back of my head, I'm like, just pay your workers more. And for context too, most of my family used to work in slaughterhouses in Iowa. And so what I noticed there is power. It's corporate power. I mean, as these rural areas kind of they see their neighboring towns die, but at least they have jobs. Which led me then to all this great kind of lost literature on Appalachian coal mining towns. And I realized the parallels of the two. And I just kept digging. And it sounds kind of over the top to say, but like my home state is now captured. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but a piggy baron controls the state. That one man owns 5 million hogs. That happened in my lifetime. He wrote a $400,000 check to the governor. That's 10% of her campaign. That, for the normal politician in America, that's about 4 or 5 months of call time, where you call rich people all day. And one piggy baron with a 19-seater jet can write that check. And what I've seen too in my lifetime is pigs used to be on a farm and then they disappeared. So that's what kind of led me down this road, and kind of as dark as it can be, what gives me hope is what it could be. Like Iowa should be Italy. It should be the Hudson Valley. It should be the foodie destination of America. But it's not. It's being extracted. It's an extraction colony. All the wealth is being drained out of the state. And the scary thing is the future is most row crops in America will be robotic. And then the way this current model is designed is most meat and poultry will be owned by LLCs based in Chicago, New York, Beijing. And I think it's not hard to see how a right-wing populist fascism taps into that left behind anger. I mean, we're seeing it now. It's not hard. You know exactly what I'm saying without saying the word Trump. And to me, the challenges of this space is the capturing of the voices. I mean, you have Farm Bureau. This space is controlled by Farm Bureau, which is basically an insurance company. It profits off this concentration of these industries. So it's totally okay with what's going on here. You have something called checkoffs, where basically farmers are forced to pay into a program to advertise that they're good. Got Milk is the biggest example of it. But because of vertical integration, a lot of the largest payers into these programs are the corporations. So now these organizations are supposed to act in the interest of farmers, work against them. And then on top of it, with the privatization of land grants, these universities are really dependent on industry money. And so this whole ecosystem is supposed to basically allow to have this conversation, and it's captured by industry. And so thank God there's publications like Civil Leads that have emerged in the Counter and among others, but it's really, I mean, I think this is the most concentrated space in America, and it's really, really hard to have a conversation here because of it's kind of like the book Power Broker, if you ever read by Robert Moses, where there's so much money sloshing around where every big law firm in Des Moines is getting a little piece of the pie. So, I mean, that to me is the biggest challenge in this space, is overcoming those. It's very few people, but there's a lot of power in those very few people to maintain the current system. And we are dealing with the repercussions of that.
Lisa, Civil Leads just got a nice shout out, so I think you should go next.
Yeah, sure. So I guess, the first thing, I'm always going to say off the bat, the thing that motivates me and the biggest challenge is the climate crisis. I just, every day I wake up and I think about it, it is an emergency and it will affect every single farm and human being. And so I just have to say that. But I'm going to echo Austin and in a way, because whether I'm looking at environmental destruction, worker exploitation, animal abuse, food safety disasters, it's always a story of unchecked corporate power, almost always. And journalism is about holding power to account and also representing the stories of people who don't have power. It's one of the pillars of a thriving democracy. And so when I'm covering food, I'm thinking about the unchecked power in this industry, and that's kind of the root of everything. And Austin also said something earlier that was really interesting to me about how this should be a bipartisan issue. And as someone who is kind of concerned, as a journalist, it's part of my role is to support our democracy. And I do think that drives me because in this time of sort of extreme political polarization, these stories about the food system, I think they could and they should resonate across party lines, because the people being hurt by this system, contract farmers and cattle ranchers in rural America, and then also immigrant workers and BIPOC communities where CAFOs are being built. And, the only people really benefiting from a consolidated food system are CEOs. So there's a lot that can be pulled out there in terms of common threads that I think people need to be able to see more often.
Thank you, Lisa. William, we'd love to hear from you for what your take is on the biggest challenge in the food system and what motivates your work.
Yeah, well, I would bridge from what Lisa said, and in climate change is COVID, as bad and as disruptive as it is relatively short term, and there are likely to be more short term disruptions. But all of that is occurring against the backdrop of climate change. And and the challenges in agricultural sustainability, the business, the lives of people, the conservation of nature are really wicked problems. Certainly, the profit motive, free enterprise, concentration of capital are factors that have a big role, but there is also a tragedy of the commons going on when we're talking about our atmosphere or thinking about the landscape as a whole. There's a lack of technology and knowledge and capacity to implement new management practices as well. And so they're kind of political or socioeconomic factors, and there are ecological factors. But the fires we're seeing in the American West, the drought that's currently occurring across the Great Plains, even the recent blizzard in Texas, are all disruptors at the ground level, and they directly impact the lives of people, the lives of animals, and nature as well. And that is also becoming a driver for change in the industry. And certainly all of these issues are important and need attention, but large-scale concentrated action to abate the threat of climate change is essential now, because conditions are deteriorating, not improving. And so we need to pull the levers we have available today to start to turn the corner on climate relative to both mitigating it, reducing the greenhouse gas impacts of our activities, as well as adapting to it. What can we do on the ground to survive in a changed climate, to thrive in a changed climate? How do we build resilient communities and ecosystems? And so that along with these other questions is pretty vital.
Before we move on to John, William, I wonder if you could elaborate on the link between climate change and ranching for those who are a little less familiar.
Yeah, and John, can certainly comment on this from lived experience, but for many years I managed a ranch that the Nature Conservancy owns in eastern Colorado, and we leased that going back about 15 years to a guy who was sixth generation in his community. On one side of his family and fifth generation on the other. He was about 20 years old at the time. Home ranch wasn't big enough for him to come back to. In that period of time, he has, married and started a family, and has, been an advocate for conservation in his broader community, as well as an excellent manager of nature, his business, and his livestock on that ranch. He's faced with a decision right now due to the drought of destocking the ranch entirely. He's one of those guys that John was talking about whose primary livelihood is in ranching. He and his wife don't have off-farm jobs. And so that is a pretty dire consequence of climate change. And really, since I started working there in 2005, the wet years are what used to be average years. And the dry years are worse than they used to be, starting in 2002 and really continuing up to the present. And so that has implications for taking care of the ecological systems on the ranch. That's a driver for destocking. It has implications for the prairie chickens that live there, and it has implications for his life and livelihood. And how do we collaborate better as the Nature Conservancy with our business partner and our conservation partner, and help create a context where surviving things like really exceptional drought, or exceptional blizzards or exceptional wildfire seasons, is something where there is a policy and a business context, community context, where people can adapt to those things, not necessarily well, because they're hugely disruptive, but better, and maybe in a way where there's resilience so that they can rebuild their operation on the downside of the slope or the upside of the slope, I guess. So I'd certainly love to hear if I'm, from John's perspective as well.
Take it away, John. I know you must have lots to say on this topic.
Oh yeah, I think cattle ranching from the cow-calf sector is it's not pure, but we are very much out in the open to the changes to climate change, and that's something we're just going to have to try to make strategic plans and consider options going forward. It's an industry in which there aren't very many price supports. There's a huge there's great price support systems in place for row crop farmers, and there's just not much for animal agriculture. And that is what it is. And so dealing with the changes that are coming, the climatic changes that are coming, is just something that we're all going to have to deal with. We in this industry. Kind of going back in the conversation about concentration issues. That's we have a policy in the country for cheap food. We have cheap food in this country. And that is go ahead, come on, Austin.
I push back on that because bacon was cheaper under President Truman than than Obama. It's industry's favorite talking point, but per capita income, people in Germany and United Kingdom and Canada spend less on food than we do. At some point, it's no longer cheap, and there's so many negative externalities that we pay for it. So that
agreed. I completely agree. I don't mean to be defending. I'm just that's part of why concentration has evolved as it is. I think we really saw something a year ago when COVID took place, because there were workers that were getting sick in these huge meat processors, and I can only speak for the beef industry, but 10 or 11 of the big processing facilities went down to 60%, 70% of capacity, which created a huge bottleneck. And it drove the prices for live cattle up, drove the prices for live cattle down because there was no market for them, and drove the prices of finished beef way up. And so grocery store beef was much more expensive than it was before. And it really brought to, I think, people's attention the fragility. We have this amazingly efficient meat processing system, but it's very fragile. And last year really brought that to people's attention. I thought, at least it brought it to our attention as producers. One of the effects of it is that it made the small processors that are kind of all over the country, but there's not very many of them, and their capacity is not great. They're booked. If as a small rancher, if I wanted to get my three steers killed this fall, I'd be in a very difficult position. I mean, they're booked for the next year out. One of the upsides of this story is that in little old Sheridan, a young enterprising couple took COVID money, were able to get some COVID loans, and they built a packing plant in the last 9 months, and it's USDA certified. And that's going to open up some really interesting opportunities for local folks. As someone said earlier, it's a drop in the bucket. It's not a significant number at all, but it might offer some opportunities for some local producers. And there is more and more what I call freezer beef being offered, even in small rural communities like Sheridan. So I think it's an upside that people are becoming aware of local food, and that appreciation is growing, but it doesn't touch the overall demand or overall market, the market situation.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting line of conversation. And actually we have a question from an attendee that I'd like to share. Barring regulatory legislative intervention, can anything be done to decentralize concentrated aspects of these industries, enable information sharing amongst ranchers, farmers, and promote basic workers' rights? And I'd love to hear maybe the workers' rights perspective first, and then maybe think back towards some of the questions around like ranchers and land-based questions. So Magali, could you start? I believe your mute is still on.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get into the question. So the question is,
yeah, the question is around here. There we go. Barring regulatory, legislative intervention, can anything be done to decentralize concentrated aspects of these industries, enabling information sharing amongst ranchers, farmers, and promoting basic workers' rights? And if you have some thoughts, around decentralization and how that might affect workers too, I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Well, our approach with Venceremos, it's been about creating or adopting the worker-driven social responsibility model. We are not really involved in policy making or any of those efforts. I mean, that needs to happen to protect workers in a federal level, but we believe that we need to hold the companies accountable by targeting the supply chain. I think it's important to understand the powers that there exist within this pyramid of powers, who is on top of whom, right? So I think that because of these companies care so much of profits, um, we need to see who is on top of that, who has power over these companies in the supply chain, and who is on top of that supply chain. Well, the consumers, we have power of purchase. We have a power to demand or to demand responsibility for these companies. So our approach is slightly different than having into taking to the government. I mean, ever since the pandemic started, we've been very disappointed that workers don't trust any laws or policies, or even the agencies like OSHA are failing to protect workers, during the pandemic. So we know that there is a lot of things that needs to be done to decentralize the corporations, but really, also, what are the other solutions that exist? What other solutions that we can bring to assure the dignity and respect for these workers? Through our approach, we want to create a code of conduct that has mechanisms of reinforcement through a monitoring involvement with workers. As long as workers are not involved in the monitoring and implementation of any code of conduct, changes are not going to happen. So we need to empower workers. We need to empower the communities to support the workers' efforts and to bring them justice.
Thank you for that. And I think that's interesting. It's good to hear about, outside of the regulatory framework, some of the ideas that you think are important here. Does anybody else have any thoughts about how to decentralize these concentrated aspects of the industry?
Yeah, I would just add on two things. I mean, to that, the new packing plant John mentioned in his community is, I mean, don't forget the procurement power of your local school district. Imagine if all the schools in that area had to buy meat from that, or had certain labor standards, or like if all the dairy supplied to Wisconsin, children came from pasture. That's huge supply chain ramifications from that, because putting good meat in Dollar General doesn't change things. But if we give schools more money to buy better quality stuff for our kids, that changes things, because it's also consistent contracts. And then the other thing I would say is, it sounds weird to say too, is support journalists, and not just subscribe, but also provide information. This is what I tell journalists, farm groups in Iowa all the time. Like, story, it's really easy for a lot of journalists, if we don't tell these stories don't get told. So letting journalists know, emailing them, hey, I saw this, or this packer is treating its workers bad, or connecting journalists with the workers and showing this bad behavior is going on. I mean, that is how, just elevating these stories, I think, is so crucial. Because it's one thing to complain about, oh, the New York Times framed this story really bad, or this paper did this, that did Y. Don't go on Twitter and get all angry at the journalist. Send a nice message saying, oh, you should also talk to these people. You should do that. I mean, that to me is how I think you have a very constructive thing. Is because, don't forget, in the day, power is a moral question as a society. And the Facebook investigations we're seeing now that was driven by the news. I mean, that was the news industry. If you want to get cynical, it was Murdoch and his empire being mad that they were losing ad revenue. But it forced the politicians to catch up to the public, because the public was aware of all the issues that journalists were raising. So, I mean, that to me is the goal here too, is elevating the workers that are being exploited here. I mean, COVID and meat packers and what's happened to the workers is one of the big stories of this past year. And I think, journalists telling those stories will hopefully then lead to changes down the road.
Thanks, Austin. And I wonder, going back to the conversation more around cattle, which obviously is a different type of industry than the more concentrated animal production facilities for pork and poultry. But I'd like to understand, do you think that there are interventions in that space? And, I'd like to hear your thoughts on these antitrust applications in that space as well, both for William and John.
Oh, I don't know. The antitrust, that's a big one. That's I've got close personal friends who took on checkoff issues in Montana, and it's super complicated. And I don't understand them very well. The difficulty is that the industry agreed that we should every time a beef animal trades hands, $1 of the sale should go for promoting a beef. The problem for some, in the opinion of some producers, cow-calf producers, it's that those promotions seem to benefit the packers more than it does the producers, and so it seems kind of inherently it's disproportionately beneficial, and so there's a lot of issue around that. I would go back. One thing I'd talk with this kind of question: what can be done to promote that? The little plant in our town. It's a wonderful thing that this plant got going, and there's a huge demand for small plants. But the inefficiencies of those small plants is very difficult. It's $200 or $300 per head, more expensive to process that animal than the bigs have, because they operate at such a scale. And that is what it is. And maybe the meat can be sold at a higher level and kind of even out. But there's also some other things, like the hides will go to waste. A whole lot of the byproducts just won't get utilized that the bigs utilize, and that's just the fact of efficiency in the harvesting industry.
I think I think I don't have a perspective to comment on antitrust, but there is. I mean, make no mistake, there is concentration in the beef industry, but it's at the packer processor level. And I think the big 5 packer processors, I think about 80% of the beef in the United States passes through those plants. And to John's point, the efficiency is really remarkable. The big plants use everything except the tip of the animal's tail. And they safely, by and large, package and process a protein product that is consumed widely in the United States and shipped globally. And I think it is very important to be a realist about the strengths and weaknesses, the problems and the benefits of the current system, and what the strengths and weaknesses, the problems, the benefits of alternative systems might be if we shifted to them wholesale. A paradigm shift in terms of how we produce, harvest, package, ship, deliver, and consume beef is likely to have a number of repercussions that are very difficult to foresee. And I think we have to be very serious about finding a different, better future, and also very serious about not assuming that there is a utopian alternative out there available to us. We are dealing with a set of really wicked problems in the beef industry, where solution to one causes very negative repercussions in another segment. And so, if I had one message to deliver, is be a pragmatist and be realist about how we provide, a growing human population with a safe and plentiful food supply over the long term in a way that also protects the planet. That is not an easy thing to do. It's no silver bullet.
I'd interrupt. I'm excited by the interest in local foods and more healthy foods, if you will. And I think these small plants, while I'm highlighting their inefficiencies, they also have there's upside for that because they're small enough where workers need to do various activities. So they're not, máquinas. They're not just doing one thing repetitively for their entire career. They have to do different things. And so I think there's a big future for that. It requires producers to become marketers and expand. They have to market their own products as well. And usually producers are not good advertisers, and vice versa. And so that's the downside. The upside might be that that means there's another job for somebody else in the next generation to add value to the organization. So it's complicated.
The system we have now is radical. I think that's it's radical that 1 in 3 hogs, and we're basically destroying states like Iowa to provide protein to other countries. Does that make sense? Does it make sense that 70% of our apple juice in America comes from China? We're shipping water across the world in climate change. It makes no sense. That is radical. The solutions are easy. That's what's really frustrating about this space. You plant cover crops. You do basic things. Ethanol's collapsing, cars moving to batteries, put animals on pasture, boom, bada bing. We can't solve it because people profit off this broken system. And so yes, it's great that you're seeing these little trial things. Until we alter the structures, the system will not change. When Obama tried, Vilsack tried to do all that reform, they didn't have the political courage to alter the structures, so nothing changed. That's what I'm always, I will be very careful in the framing of this. If nothing we're talking about where we should go is radical, what we have now is radical, and what we're trying to do is traditional.
I think that's an interesting framing, Austin, because I think it highlights the fact that, and I think one thing that was brought up earlier is the vulnerabilities in this system. And I think John mentioned that it's very fragile, right? And I think that's part of its radicalness, that, there are other systems that could be more sustainable for people and the planet. And one of the things we wanted to cover today, while we're kind of waning on time, was the effect of shocks in helping us see some of those problems and the things that we maybe could do to fix that. And so, two of those shocks, obviously, we've got COVID-19, which has been a critical and devastating shock to workers, but also the longer shock of climate change that we've brought up earlier. So we wanted to delve into that a little bit more and just hear from folks, what are you seeing on the ground in your space? And I'd love to hear, from Lisa, if you could give us a bit of an overview, and then I would love to hear from the rest of our panelists.
Sure, it's a huge question. A lot has happened over the last year. I think the biggest thing, there was sort of a long trajectory of change starting last February, and someone mentioned earlier the efficiency of the system we have now, right? And it's incredibly efficient and specialized, and so all of the meat that normally at very high volumes is moving through the supply chain very quickly and efficiently. When there's a shock and one little piece of that, is disrupted, then things tend to fall apart pretty quickly. And we saw that a little bit when there were some, the COVID outbreaks started in meatpacking plants, which are very large. And as Magali has been talking about, lots of people working in them very close together. And as they started to shut down, there was just an immediate ripple effect where then, pork producers in Iowa were sitting there with thousands of hogs ready to go to slaughter and nowhere to send them. And, there's then, the plant shut down. And so then the grocery store that was waiting for the meat isn't able to fill the case. And then people are panicking. And that all happened very quickly. And because the system is so specialized, it was very hard for them to make super quick changes. Whereas I think what we saw from smaller producers is, if they were normally selling at the farmer's market and all of a sudden the market shut down, they can quickly reach out to the people in their community and say, I have this meat, do you want to buy it? They didn't have the same structures in place that kind of prevent a fast pivot. And although then it also kind of brought out this other, fragility in the local space, which was that the processing capacity, all the bigger processors were struggling. So I think John mentioned then, everybody started turning to these smaller processors. And guess what? There weren't enough left because those were all put out of business years ago by the bigger guys. And so now there weren't enough. And most small ranchers, farmers that I'm talking to now are trying to get appointments for into 2022 and can't even get appointments. So it's it definitely just exposed a lot of fragility. And I think there is a little bit of an understanding now that efficiency, obviously some level of efficiency is a good thing, but I think maybe people are starting to think about the fact that we can't sacrifice resilience for efficiency, especially with a climate crisis that is going to be causing many more disruptions in the future. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's the big, I could, there's a lot more, but I know we're running out of time. So
yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think that's a really helpful framing. And I think also just I'm glad you kind of caught that ball around shocks and helped explain what I meant by that. So thanks for that. And so I real quick, we should be wrapping up soon, but I wanted to get just kind of a final thought from everybody. Obviously, these are big and challenging questions, and I want to honor that we've got some back and forth that I think is highlighting the fact that we're working within a system where there's a lot of viewpoints and ways of thinking about it. But I was wondering if just if you had one chance and something that you wanted to share with our group that you'd like to leave people with. And we'll lead off with Magali.
Well, I thank you for everybody to be here, and I really want to encourage everybody to think and to connect. Where is our food comes from? How is that being processed? And what is my responsibility to uplift the workers' efforts? I've heard many times people saying, well, I don't eat chicken. Well, you eat also vegetables, and working conditions for these workers that ain't better there. And so we have a responsibility to protect us as human beings. We should care for the well-being of the community because that also affects us. And I always said that COVID has shown us how connected we are to each other, how vulnerable we are with each other. And I think that that should be as powerful enough to bring us together, to fight together for the well-being of the other. And so, yeah, I think that I just want people to reflect and what is our role to change the current reality that we have that, of course, is not sustainable.
Thank you, Magali. Now let's, I'm just going to go down my line here. I'd like to hear from Austin, William, John, and then Lisa. Just your final closing thought.
Final closing thoughts are, I think it's just really relevant, and she hasn't gotten attention for this, but New Haven's Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro has been really, really good in this space, especially in beef. She's really highlighted a lot of the corruption around JBS, the largest packer here. And this fun little fact is her legislative director is a beef farmer himself, and he's from Central Illinois. So I think that's goes to show you the power of a little birdie in the ear. She really cares about labor. And what I also want to say is focus on the positive. I mean, think of what the food system could be, a decentralized, localized food system. And imagine what a good meal at Yale could be if it was from dairy from the state. I mean, we respected the labor, not only who picked it, but who also processed it, cooked it, and served it. Middle class is a construct, and I think that's been lost in history. I mean, meatpacker was a low-wage job. Then it became a middle-class job because we constructed it that way, and then reverted back to low wage. So these are all choices we make as a society, and I think returning food to this sense of culture and respecting it, I think, is a really positive vision that people crave in these dark times.
Thanks, Austin. William?
Yeah, I think, if I could leave folks with one takeaway, it's that grazing lands are under a variety of threats, climate change and conversion. And by and large, they are adapted ecologically. They need grazing as an ecological process to maintain their health. It can be done better or worse, but by and large, grazing is vital ecologically, and it gives value to those lands. And if we didn't have cattle adding value to those lands, almost any other land use is worse ecologically and climate-wise for those lands. And so we need to do it better in a variety of ways. I think there are huge opportunities for doing that. But but that is for the challenges associated with raising cattle. There are huge downsides if we walked away from that. It is pretty vital to our rural communities and our ecological systems, biodiversity conservation.
Thanks, William. And John, and then Lisa, and if we could, we are running out of time, so I hate to rush you, but maybe 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I've already spoken too much. I think that conservationism and agriculture don't always work perfectly together, but they don't have to be antithetical, and they really can work together and be productive all the way around. I would put in a little offer a film if you haven't seen Kiss the Ground. Check that out. It's a great another film featuring Gabe Brown and some regen agriculture. It's growing. It's still a very small movement, but it's growing, and things like this are important to keep bring this up to folks' attention. Thanks.
Thanks.
I'll be super quick. I'll just make a plug for journalism and just say, please pay attention to the way food intersects with all of these things we're talking about, immigration rights, environmental impact, worker justice. I can't write these stories, and other people like me can't write these stories unless you read them. So.
Thanks, Lisa. And that's all the time we've got today, but you guys have given us so much to think about. And I'm just so grateful for you to give us sort of this broad understanding of, the various ways that our food supply chain is, vulnerable and who's being affected, and the chances that we have to make a difference. So I think you've given us so much to think about, and I really appreciate your time today. And so just for all of our audience members in the chat, there's a link to a coffee chat. If you want to join us, we'll just be there hanging out for 15 minutes, and it'll be more of an open forum chat with folks. So hope to see you all there. Go ahead and click on that link, and then we're going to close down this this meeting room. So see you there.
Also, a quick plug for the next panel that's coming up in the same room. I see a couple of the panelists are here a little early. It's on farmers